Like many of you, I suspect, I spent much of the weekend preparing for the somewhat different world we'll be living in for the next few months. For some time we've been discussing the developing corona crisis and the impact it's going to have here as it's had overseas, and the character test it's likely to be for all of us and our nation. But with large gatherings now banned and overseas travel virtually at a halt, half-empty supermarkets, and I think a more genuine sense of fear than we had even last week, the reality, I'd say, is finally sinking in. If anyone is still wondering why France, Spain, Switzerland, Austria, Norway, Denmark, now the Netherlands, have all joined Italy in virtual lockdown, and why we're not all that far behind here in Australia with working from home and social distancing now the rule, here's why. As one report put it last night, with infections increasing more than 20% each day, it would only take 4 weeks from now for 50,000 people to have the disease, and that's just here in Victoria. And even if only 1 in 5 needs hospitalisation, that's 10,000 extra emergency room presentations. And even if only 1 in 5 of them needs intensive care, that's an extra 2,000 people in intensive care in Victoria. And that's the problem: beds in intensive care. That's what's behind all these announcements: the lockdowns, the movement restrictions, attractions closed and events cancelled. It's all about intensive care beds, because we only have around 2,000 ventilator beds in the whole of Australia. And they're what's needed when the most severe forms of coronavirus, when people can't breathe for themselves, the ventilators will do it for them and keep them alive. This is why it's so important to slow the spread of this disease, which we know is at least as infectious as the common cold, but far more deadly than normal seasonal flu, which already kills around 1,000 Australians each year. The big risk, as we know, is to older Australians. In China, among people over 80 years of age diagnosed with coronavirus, some 20% have died. In Italy, which was slow to react to the threat, which has now got more than 24,000 infections and over 1,800 deaths, the health system has been overwhelmed, and doctors are having to leave some people untreated because of lack of beds and lack of ventilators. This, of course, is what all other countries, including us, are now desperate to avoid: letting people die who normally we could save. Hence the move late last week from apparent complacency to obvious alarm. Now, the good news is that based on reports from China, we can get on top of this. Thanks to a virtual lockdown over the past 6 weeks, new infections in China are, we're told, down to double digits, and the death count also down to single digits. So for everyone's sake, and especially the sake of our elderly loved ones, we all just have to live differently for a while. And maybe living differently is not a bad thing. To have a family dinner at home rather than going out to play footy in the backyard with the kids or the local park rather than heading off to a stadium, and to read a book or play a board game rather than going to the movies. For people in home isolation, because they've either been in contact with someone who has the disease or they've just come home from overseas, there could be the satisfaction perhaps of rediscovering how to cook or to sew or make a start on that foreign language you've always said you wanted to learn. If you're home for 14 days, I don't know me, I'll be cleaning out my cupboards or tidying up my home office. Let's face it, staying home for the good of others might end up making us all a little more resourceful, and to slow down our hectic lives and help us refocus on what's really important. For those of us whose income is dependent on travel and tourism, this is a really tough time, because they of course face the added stress of financial uncertainty. For people working in airlines, driving taxis or Ubers, serving in restaurants and bars and working in gyms, it's going to be very slow. Now, we wish it wasn't like that, but it is likely to be, unavoidably, the reality. Business owners will need interest holidays and foreclosure moratoriums from their lenders. Workers too will need a more general version of the exceptional circumstances income support payments that governments have long given drought-stricken farmers. Of all the government's stimulus measures announced last Thursday, the best is immediate access to sickness benefits without the usual waiting periods and without the usual need to run down your liquid assets for people who can't work for a period due to coronavirus. And a second stimulus package flagged today, well, I suspect there'll be more in it for workers. Because here's the most important thing we all need to know and say reassuringly to others. This will pass, which it will pass. It might be 3 months, it could be 6 months, it could be longer, but it will pass. Because coronavirus will eventually become less dangerous, there will be a vaccine, and normal life will resume. I've been saying for weeks now, this will be a real test of character. For us as individuals, of course, but also for Australia as a nation. We need to just pull together to make sure everything is done to help people, the health vulnerable and the financially vulnerable in particular, to cope in the meantime. Of all the places to be where this hits in the world, rather than think how inconvenienced we might be, say a little prayer of thanks that instead we are here in Australia. I don't know about you, but there's nowhere else I would want to be at a time like this.